So my name is Luciana Russell, I'm the Arts Officer for Kildare County Council, and thanks to Shane and Riverbank for inviting me here this evening. My office is upstairs, so it wasn't too much of a journey to make this evening. And it's a great pleasure to be here. It was we had a lovely night here a fortnight ago for the exhibition launch for this show, and I suppose it feels Shane won the Emerging Artist Bursary Award in 2020 I suppose it was awarded April last year, and there is always a gestation period so that work can be made, but this was a little bit longer for COVID and other reasons, so it was a great pleasure to be here. And this is the first exhibition with people in it and an audience since COVID, so this is, I suppose, it feels symbolic for lots of different reasons. I'm going to maybe introduce our panel as they speak, and the first person that we're going to speak to tonight is Shane himself. So Shane, you're the reason we're all here tonight. So just to give a synopsis, if anybody doesn't know who Shane is, he's a lens-based visual artist interested in rural Ireland, bogs and the built environment. His photographic work is project-based with a research and anthropology approach using social and environmental issues. The metaphorical exploration of place, space and land underpins his visual inquiry and acts as a significant subtext throughout his work. Shane studied at Belfast School of Art in the University of Ulster, where he completed a Master of Fine Arts in Photography in 2019. He's a recipient, as I mentioned, of the 2020 Emerging Visual Artist Bursary Award, which was supported by Kildare County Council and Riverbank Arts Centre. His work has been shown at a number of group exhibitions, including the RHA Annual 2020 and 2021. I think actually maybe some of this work we might refer to it, Shane, was in that show. And his practice has also been co-funded by the Arts Council. So this project, Beofhód, is showing in Riverbank as a solo exhibition until the 23rd of December. So Shane, over to you.
No problem. Thanks everyone for coming. It's great to have this tonight. Hope you have a good night and have nice chats and everything. So I'll just give you a brief introduction to myself and the project, maybe expand a little bit on what Luciana has read out there. So I'm kind of really interested in rural Ireland, bogs and the built environment. Particularly interested in the kind of metaphor and the metaphorical exploration of place and land. And when I do that, kind of draw on social and environmental issues at the time. So some of the kind of wider themes that I explore in my practice is like our relationship with the land, the idea of a growing sense of disconnection with the land and subsequently with our past. People might have noticed in recent decades there's been a decline of small farmers and a growth in the commuter lifestyle as well, which is kind of caused that disconnection to kind of grow. And I kind of like the idea of like how knowledge and memory from the past lives on in our surroundings. And if we have a loss of connection with the land, there's a kind of a loss of connection with our past and the previous lessons that we've learned. In terms of like location, I kind of focus a lot on the Midlands, where I'm from. And the idea that the Midlands is seen as kind of flyover country, where you get on the motorway and just drive across it as fast as you can and get on the Grey Ocean Road or the Wide Atlantic Way or whatever way it's branded. I always get it wrong. So for me, like the sense of the familiar and how we don't see what's right in front of us, it's quite significant. It's often overlooked and unseen. I kind of tend to explore that a lot and focus on the ordinary and the everyday. So just in terms of my project here that's on display, I kind of have a synopsis here that kind of for this event. So like kind of to acknowledge the culture that's derived from our environment, from our relationship with bogs up to this point, and also embrace a future relationship and the changes needed for a better environment. In terms of the work and the themes and concepts that I explored, there's a lot of stuff that I looked at, there's a lot of stuff that I kind of messed around with. There's a lot of layers of meanings and interpretation within bogs. It was difficult to kind of pick one or two. But there's a few here I mentioned that they're very significant for the work that actually ended up in the wall. The idea of bog as a metaphor, like the bog is alive, it's organic, It's also an archive with layers of history. The idea of archaeology then and their excavations on the bogs, I kind of use it as a metaphor of history and other stuff like memory and knowledge. And then the name Beofhód itself translates as life beneath the sod in from Irish, and that kind of gives you a real rich kind of subject matter for artistic exploration. It's full of stories, which is also something that kind of like to explore and excavate. The idea of duality, there's quite a few, I won't kind of go into too much, but I kind of love the idea of duality. It's something I really like to explore. So like in terms of man and nature, tradition and modernity, light and dark, space and place, urban and rural. And then also the work is all shot in analog, so there's a duality there with the kind of digital age. The theme of time is very strong within the work. It's kind of almost implied. It's kind of in it naturally. The bogs are 10,000 years old and full of history. The idea of change as well, and documenting change and the time across change. Like our relationship with bogs have shifted quite a lot since they've been there for 10,000 years. And we're in the middle of another shift now, moving from tradition and cultural identity across to conservation. So I mentioned there's kind of like applied things like the environmental issues, the climate change, the idea of climate and social justice going hand in hand is really important for the work. It's something that's kind of really core for now. Just in terms of the work that's on the wall, there's kind of 3 different types of work. There's the landscape work here, which is mostly the ones that are on cliffs. It's the majority of the work. This kind of work is really about connecting with my landscape through photography. It's quite an emotional and intuitive connection that I developed as I made the work. The idea of geography, of using geography to express how I feel, slowing down, kind of noticing things, kind of meditating on it, a sense of connection, engaging with the surroundings. So that's really important within the landscape work. Photography is a tool of expression, how I see the world, how I see the bog, how I experience the bog. It's all very important within the work. The kind of an uncanny kind of a beauty in it. It's slightly unsettling, but it's familiar. There's a sense of tension within it. Like I really like the idea of holding the cultural identity that we derive from bogs in one hand and the environmental conservation in the other, holding them close together. There's a slight duality there, and I think that's a really important part of the work, bringing the two of them together. In terms of the grid pieces, there's one here, another one here. This work is kind of more about the people and the tradition. The idea of the workmanship that was in the bog and camaraderie. And then the kind of the word that I always find very difficult to pronounce, anthropomorphic qualities of the bog itself. So the human qualities of the turf footings, and you can hear from this one. That's very important in the work. This work is more forensic. It kind of looks at the details of it more. And this one here, the people, looks at the detail and architecture of the bog. And then the whole idea of change, what will be lost, the end of an era, the legacy that's left behind is quite important. So then the final element of the work that I have on the wall is the paper. So there's one piece over here and then there's 9 pieces here. So these are all handmade, 100% made from peat and macerated turf. It was important for me to have an element of materiality in the project, and this is something that developed later. I've been maybe about a year working on this. It's kind of like an idea that the bog photograph in itself, kind of like a cyanotype, with the plants in it and stuff like that. Plants from the bog as well, so the kind of place and time coming together. There's a metaphor within that, like there's a metaphor for the fragility of the bog infrastructure and the ecosystem there, so that kind of a play on that. And then there's a commentary, kind of the commodification of bogs, which is something that's happened over the last 100 years. So look, the goal of the discussion tonight, for me, as I set it out, was to kind of explore our understanding of bogs and their relationships with them. And discuss the different meanings that they hold and how we value and perceive them. So, as previously mentioned, their bogs are many things. A resource, they're the source of fuel, they're a source of employment, they're an island within pastoral land. There's a kind of an unknown element about them which makes them really interesting. They're a refuge for flora and fauna, they're an archive of history, they're a source of inspiration for artists and writers, and they're a powerful metaphor for Ireland and society. So just for tonight now, I'd like to encourage the audience to contemplate what the bog means to them, to yourselves, whether it's based on a personal attachment or an experience of being in the bog, or an imagining or a feeling, what comes to mind when you think of a bog. So a lot of stuff, maybe just kind of imagine that. So after the initial introductions are done, we're going to probably open up a bit more and have a bit more of an informal discussion. And questions and comments are welcome from the audience. So hope you have a good night, and thanks very much for coming. Thanks everyone.
Okay, thanks Shane. You can't beat hearing the artists speak about their own work, and how lovely to be here surrounded by the work as well. And I know, Shane, you said about the materiality of these pieces here, and I like the idea of the bog taking a photograph of itself, but I mean all of the work, I don't know, is it the texture of the paper that you use, but there is that materiality in all of it. I suppose your source material lends itself to that as well, but anyhow, we might get back to that later on. So, as Shane said, we're going to, Eamonn's going to speak next, and then Nuala will speak after that, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. So Eamonn, can I hand over to you, please? But before we do that, now I'll introduce you. So Eamonn Mulvihill is a former principal and teacher of history and English in Kildare. He has a keen interest in local history, landscape and heritage. He has family connections with the land and the bogs in Kildare and Kerry. Eamonn was a founding member of Kildare Town Heritage Company, and he has published numerous articles on local history and education. He has worked with the Department of Education on curriculum development and history, and served on the National Centre for Guidance and Education. He cherishes his bog memories of the past and of Bordnamona, and he regards the bog and turf as part of his heritage and life experience. So over to you, Eamonn.
Though you had all that information this
There you
evening.
go. I was going to say
Thank
more,
you.
but some of it was libelous, so we knew it's being recorded.
Hello everybody, and thanks to say that, and congrats to Shane on this fabulous display of photography. To say a picture speaks 1,000 words, so Shane really doesn't have to speak at all. It's a beautiful exhibition, and I was attracted to the reasons why he had the exhibition of these photographs. To elicit from people their bog images and bog memories. And I suppose the theme of what I want to talk about briefly is mind images of the bog experience. And when I worked in Kildare Town Heritage, I remember the village came to the town, and we had 3 H's for why they'd come. One was horses, one was highway, and one was heritage. These were the 3 reasons the village people came to the townspeople. And when I think of the bogs, I think of 4 H's. I think of heritage, heat, hardship, and happiness. These are 4 things that would summarise my bog experiences. As was hinted there, my father and mother came from between the Stole and Ballylongford. So my dad, they were both from dairy farmers, and my dad came up to Enfield in County Meath near Johnstown Bridge in 1950 with a violin and a wife. And he had a house going with a job, which was managing a dairy farm. But somebody advised him, a guard I think in the area, advised him to go into Bordnamona, where his wages would be £5 a week instead of £3, 10 shillings. So at an early age I would have had experience of helping the dad to cut turf with a schlong, as they call it. He had a left-handed schlong. It was a right-handed one and a left-handed one. And I would have helped to wheel out the turf. And then at the age of 8 or 9 I was sent to Kerry for summers to mind my granny. So when I looked out the window of the house towards Ballylongford, the high bog was outside, and it wasn't a mountain, it was just high bog. They called it the mountain. And in the evenings in August I used to go shooting with my uncle. He did the shooting, I did the walking around him. And I remember being in dread of the bog pools that were supposed to be bottomless, all around Gravel Bog. And he would shoot grouse. And today the grouse are gone, of course. And I remember the fear of falling into one of those bottomless bog pools. And I remember collecting the monodons. These were the red berries on the bog. And there was a story which was true of a man called John Jeffcott who ploughed up the Ballylongford Cross, which was a gold cross presented by John O'Connor of Kerry to the Franciscans of Lislochton Abbey, where Brennan Kennedy was recently buried. And he ploughed up the cross 200 years after the monks buried it, fleeing from Cromwell, or Henry Ireton, who was Cromwell's son-in-law, in 1658 or 9. The monks rang the bell after the Cromwellians passed by, but they saw this as a threat and they went back and massacred some of the monks. But it's amazing that that cross has the 4 evangelists on each end of it, and it's in the National Museum in Dublin. And it was ploughed up 200 years after it was placed in a boggy cutaway bog. A second image, I suppose, that strikes me is I remember reading a thesis done by a teacher in Kildare, actually, Mary Burke was her name. And she did a thesis on the bogs and rural area around Monastrell. And in the middle of the thesis, she had an image of a Bishop of Kildare and Loughlin coming to say Mass in the middle of the Bog of Allen, in the middle of the penal laws, at 6 o'clock on a summer's morning. And there was nobody around. And in the thesis, it was mentioned that people began to come out of the ground and to come in huge numbers to the Mass. And it struck me that people were living in the turf tanks in huge numbers in the 1700s in the Bog of Allen. And the same was true in parts of Kerry, because my parents, both their farms were owned by a landlord called John Ben Walsh in the 19th century. He was an English Conservative MP who owned 9,000 acres in Kerry. He inherited it from his wife's uncle, who made his money in India, in the East India Company. But what's interesting is in his diaries, when you look at them, he says in the 19th century that there were swarms of tenants, or nests of tenants, living on the fringes of the bogs. On that fringe between the bog and the land. And he needed to get rid of them because they weren't money makers. They lived on a moneyless economy, and he wanted to get rid of them. And I was amazed at that image from his diaries. My grandfather's house in Kerry was roofed with scraws from the bog with thatch on it. That was the great-grandfather's house, before they built a newer one in the 1930s. It had bog oak beams, and even today my cousin in Kerry is talking of reseeding some cutaway bog, but he said he can't plough it because of the rocks. And I said to him, what do you mean the rocks? And he said, oh, the lumps of bog oak that are just under the surface. So that's what they call rocks in Kerry. My dad went into Bournemouth anyway, and he worked in the leveller, the bagger, the collector, and in the workshop in the winter, because the bog was a tough place in the winter time. And I remember him saying that the hardest job of all was a row of men throwing turf into a collector on a hot summer's day, because the collector moved at an even pace, and the men had to keep going in front of it. And he described that as the toughest job of all. The bagger is a word in its own. And Jack Hart, you probably are aware of this book. I won't read from it right now, but Jack Hart, his life parallels mine in some ways. He wrote that book, in the wake of the bagger. His father left Sligo and came down to Lanesborough and worked. He was a blacksmith in Sligo and worked in Bordemona, like my own dad. And there were trade union struggles because he wasn't recognised as having a trade, even though he was a blacksmith. And Jack ended up going to college in Longford. He ended up principal of Lucan Community College after teaching. So in some ways, I was saying to him recently, his life parallels my own. In Muckland Bog, Timahoe Bog, my dad worked for 35 years, but he always regarded the bog as a sideshow to the land. He never really took it seriously, even though it was his main livelihood. He used to rent land part-time, and he was really at heart a farmer. And many small farmers used the bog to subsidise their income. My bog memories of the 60s are, I footed turf there, and I was a fully fledged adult at the age of 16 because I was able to get a card in Eamonn and earn a wage. And a young lad could go in and earn a man's wage at that age, no problem. And I had 5 brothers with me, so my dad's income went up very highly during the summer months. I think it went from something like 15 or 20 pounds a week to 80 or 90 pounds a week in the 60s. This was major income at that time. I remember the whole transportation on the railway line that is on the photograph there. The locos, the service wagon with all the gloves and the shovels, and there was a buzz of industrialisation about the bog. And one of the big issues for the men were that they weren't paid industrial wages. They were treated as rural workers in Bordemona. I remember working, itinerants came to the bog, and they would light their own bonfire, and they would stay a while and go again, probably because of wanderlust or maybe some lack of interest in any kind of permanency. Women came, widows came, some children came, boys and girls, and worked in the bog in the 60s. And I have a poem that I just read for you from the 60s called Bog Memories of the 1960s. Walking through the dewy fog on an August blue morning to the brown bog, footing turf in formation, backs bent. White shirts dotting the distant trench top. The bagger belches out fresh turf away in trench 25. Barrett and Flynn on day shift. In West 28, a dragline twists and turns. Noel Gorman making drains. Sitting around the bonfire mid-morning, loaded with black billy cans, lids dancing, tea in the rough with sugar mixed, stirring with a heather stem, milking carelessly, drinking gladly, eating sun-warmed corn cake and biscuits that looked alien with glossy packaging from another world. Yellow machines tracked with iron, grinding in heat and bog dust, supervised by tanned-faced men on motorbikes. Tony O'Keefe lit the fire for the 1 o'clock tea, and a young holiday boy goes to the rail line for water from yellow water barrels. Most of the work is done between 2 and 4. Early homegoers break the back of enthusiasm. By 6 in the evening the bog is empty, the goat bird sings, while fox and heron pave their tracks on wet man-made turf. Now, a lot of poets wrote about the bog. I won't quote too much from them, but Teresa Brayton in North Kildare wrote The Old Bog Road, and John McKee mentions that she was a woman with her heart in the right place because she loved the boring of the bog road, the hawthorn tree on the Old Bog Road. And then my dad founded Potas Kyotori in Enfield and called it the Teresa Brayton branch after Teresa, who really presents in her poetry mind images of the bog from North Kildare in the 1880s and of life in Kildare in the 1880s. And people in Boston and New York got a great sense of home from reading the poetry of Teresa Brayton. Kavanagh in the poem The Christmas Childhood, this is going on with the Christmas shade, isn't it? The exhibition. Yeah. Not my talk, no, the exhibition. But Kavanagh mentions in The Christmas Childhood, you know that poem where the back of the potato pits was white with frost, how wonderful that was, how wonderful. He mentions the bog twice, after saying that somebody wistfully twisted the bellows wheel. I used to get the students to look up the word wistfully in expectation of the fire lighting. But he says a water hen screeched in the bog, and his father played melodeon outside of our gate. My mother made the music of milking. And then he says, across the wide bogs the melodeon called to lands and talons. So he had a great sense of the neighbours. And the bog was almost in a wilderness in contrast to the magic of Christmas inside. I'm interested too in other poets and people who mention the bog in passing. Pádraig Colin mentions it in An Old Woman of the Roads, where he says, "Oh, to have a little house to warm the heart and stool and all, to heap up sods upon the fire, the pile of turf against the wall." And Colin also mentions the brown bogs and black water in the poem The Drover. So, just to leave poetry aside for a minute, I wouldn't like to just pass it totally without just saying that little book is one of my favourite my collection, A Life in the Broom by the Rectangular poet William Byrne. And he said that the purple heather is the bog. God gave, the purple heather is the cloak. God gave the bogland brown. But man has made a pall of smoke to hide the distant town. And that little book, the last time I saw a copy of that was in a glass case in Newbridge Library. And in the back cover here it says, I was taught English in St. Kieran's, Kilkenny by the author of these verses in 1902 and by his brother Peter Byrne. They were both from Rectangular. And also by Thomas MacDonagh, who died in 1916. But the opinions of the press are mentioned at the back of the book. And the Daily News says, Mr. Byrne's verse is real poetry. He writes of his own country, the central plains of Ireland, lying about the immense bog of Allen, a sea of peat and heather flats, cut with numerous canals and ditches, all flower-lined, and he feels its essential beauty. So that's one of my favourite little books. He's a great sense of peace of the bogs. And finally, just to say a word about Bordemona, the founders of Bordemona travelled to Russia and Germany to get ideas about bog development. And I've read quite a bit, and Todd Andrews is one of my favourite writers. He wrote about the bog in an essay called Turf and Myth, and he describes how turf was 80% water, and how it was a real miracle of deliverance to develop Bordemona and to burn this thing called turf, and to make electricity out of it. Despite all the initial obstacles of work camps, building roads, machines, drainage systems, and so on. And in September 2009, I visited Auschwitz just after I retired from teaching. And strange to say, when I stood in Auschwitz and I saw in Germany the railway line to the concentration camp, I couldn't but think of the railway line that went straight from Trench 31 in Muckland Bog, where I worked, all the way to the power station at Allenwood, where the turf was a cremation, as you know. Except that in Germany, of course, in Auschwitz, in Poland, it was people that were bringing on the railway line. And that image, you know why that image hit me so strongly? I know you have a different idea there, Shane, but we probably feel a little bit of guilt now that we cut out the bogs. I said to my dad one time, did you mind levelling acres and acres of beautiful heather? And he said to me, in typical Kerry man, he said, the fact that I was levelling it didn't stop me admiring it. But there's perhaps a sense of guilt that we cut out the bogs in a way. But the men in the past that I listened to talking around bog fires, they used to say that some of the systems were Stalinist systems, where rates were set by what the best man could do rather than what the average man could do. So finally, despite the hardship of the bog work and the trade union frictions, there was a great comradeship among workers. And I've tried to express some of this in a poem called Bog Hardship, which I'll read for you at the end if we have time. I don't think any historian has fully charted the social impact of Bordemona on the ordinary lives of people and their families. A lot of men stayed on, married Kildare women. A lot of other men emigrated and took the boat to England, as John B. Keane has, and married many young men of 20. But images of the bog, past and present, I think they enable us to cherish the heritage and the health benefits of boglands, and look maybe to a new vision of the future. Whether it's wind power or solar power or whatever, I hope it will facilitate human recreation and wildlife, so that we can hear again the sounds of the grouse and the plover and the curlew and the Gowrie Rua, which was the little brown boat bird. And when he sang, it was time to go home and make the hay. But he was a harbinger of fine weather. Okay, Lucina, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
There are a few mind images of the bog for me.
Okay, and you can see, I mean, you've obviously had a very passionate about what you speak about. I imagine you were standing in the classroom. Did you teach? So you taught history and English in secondary school?
Yeah, I used to like to teach history on the Boyne Valley from source to sea. The Boyne rises in Knockcurbog near Carberry and flows into Newbury Hall. And then, like teenagers go, and the great rivers of the world, it goes in the opposite direction to where it's destined. And it turns around by Eamonn and Ballybogan and heads up into County Meath, where I belong, I suppose. Okay. And I used to find that the Boyne River pulled together history from all epochs and eras. And the river became a thread that linked together monuments from different eras. So I used to use that and use landscape as a history tool, as you would in Kildare town teaching history, because the landscape and the monastery, a lot of monasteries are surrounded by bog. Clonmacnoise is a lovely example of river and bog protecting the monastery. So I used to bring that into history teaching and heritage studies and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I enjoyed that.
I'm from Meath as well. We tend to seek each other out. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So I'm glad. I feel a bit more reassured.
Where,
I felt a little bit
where in Meath are you
outnumbered here.
from? Where in Meath are you?
Kilmainham Wood.
Oh, yeah.
No bogs.
Yeah.
Anyhow, we better move on. But funny, Eamonn, it's just in preparation for tonight. I mean, you're looking at that image there and you're talking about training to outfit. Last night when I was just thinking about tonight, and I was just thinking about people who came to the bog to work, from the west, and what they brought with them, and actually just thinking of Rathcarron in Meath, where it's a Gaeltacht, and I just the news last night about those people that drowned in the channel, and migrants who wanted a better life, and how they're that terrible tragedy, and just about, I suppose, people that came to Kildare and other places. They were useful.
It was
people.
really migration, from west and south into Kildare, and I worked with so many of them. Learned so much.
Yeah.
It was a second university for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been through Maynooth and Trinity, but the bog was just as good.
Yeah. And Cathy O'Kennedy, a dancer who lived in Kildare for many years, she did, you might have come across her, Nuala, she did a project based on the huts that are left in the Curragh, or in the I'm moving from the bogs to the Curragh now, but the little huts that would have been left behind with blankets and mattresses, the little camps left behind it, and just the memory that carries in the physical space, even though the men had long left. But as well, it just mentioned about the land and about that sort of hierarchy of land, that maybe that the bog was lower class land than the regular farm as well. So we could be here all night talking about there's so many layers to the bog, isn't there? As to what we could discuss.
There are, the bog, as I said, for my dad, his heart was in the land, but he had to earn his living in the bog.
Yeah.
But he knew both very well, and was delighted to retire from the bog and spend 20 years farming land, rented land. He didn't own the land, which my mother always said was a blessing, because she said we'd be fighting over it if we had.
I know, another complex relationship at land we could talk about. I'd be here all night, but I think a lot of it's the emotional response as well, and certainly what you said. So Nuala's sitting here very patiently. So Nuala, just to introduce you, Nuala Madigan is the CEO of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, and she's a graduate of Agriculture and Environmental Science with a Masters of Education. Working at the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, her previous role as Environmental Education Officer has allowed her to work across all generations, exploring and promoting the many values Irish peatlands offer our communities. People today and in the future should have the opportunity to discover the many values of Irish peatland habitats, from their traditional uses through to their values as carbon stores for water regulation and unique biodiversity. So Nuala, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here again to extend my congratulations, and I suppose a thank you to Shane for bringing the peatlands to his exhibition and exploring Kildare through peatlands. I think it's really important. As said in my short bio there, my name is Nuala, and I work with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. We're a national charity. We were founded in 1982. And our mission is to conserve a representative sample of Irish peatlands for people today and future generations to enjoy. Our organisation started by a conversation about the loss that was visually being experienced around the Midlands of Ireland. That visual loss started when a Dutch scientist came to our country to study our peatlands, and the attitude we had was we had loads of bogs in Ireland, and we do. 20% of the island of Ireland is covered in peatland habitat. But what he experienced was a very similar story to what was happening throughout Europe. We had seen the value of peatlands for beneath the bog, rather than all of the variety of values that peatlands offer us. And these are known as the ecosystem services of peatlands, or the benefits we all gain from our peatland habitats. So we encouraged a conversation to begin in University College Dublin with students and professors, and that conversation led to the foundation of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. From there, their aim is to raise awareness of peatland habitats, their biodiversity and their ecosystem services. We do that through conservation of sites, through site management, through public awareness and research into peatlands. If I can go back on something that Eamonn said a few minutes ago about the guilt in our past, and even from a conservation point of view, I don't see any guilt there. I don't see guilt, and people shouldn't feel guilty about our peatland heritage, because we really began our peatland conservation journey only 40 years ago. Ireland used our peatlands as a fuel to cook our food, to light our homes, to heat our homes. And the research has brought us to today, to 2021. And we do know so much more than we ever knew before. Who was talking about climate change in the 1980s as we see it on the media today? Who was talking about biodiversity loss? Biodiversity, when we think about it, it was wildlife, it's the plants and animals of the bog. Water regulation and our catchments, these weren't conversations we were having. We relied on them. They were part of our everyday life. But what I see today in the bogs is that this greater understanding has brought us to a point in Ireland where we have choices. We understand of the climate benefits of peatlands, and they are restored carbon. The plants, the living bog, as a living ecosystem, they absorb carbon dioxide from our environment, but the wet nature of bogs, it prevents the natural decomposition in our gardens or our woodlands. So these boglands take in carbon and they store it. And not only Ireland, but around the world, they cover 3% of the land mass on this planet, but they store more carbon than any other habitat. Eamonn mentioned some of the biodiversity of bogs, the curlews, the frogs, the snipe, the skylark, the meadow pipit. For me, there's nothing. Come March time in the bog here in Kildare, we're listening. We're listening and watching and waiting for the curlew to arrive back. Our bogland biodiversity has experienced significant losses. We know 98% of our curlew populations are declined, but there's hope because they're not extinct yet. And I think that's really important to say, is that we can conserve a representative portion of peatlands. We can store that carbon. We can, conserve biodiversity where we are today. That we haven't gone beyond the point. And I think what's really important today is for me to reflect, and as I say, there should be no guilt, but also understand that we're not the same. We don't live the same as my grandmother or my great grandmother did, or even my mother. Who was I believe 9 before they got electricity in the west of Ireland. We are a different generation, and we have different accessibility to energy, to how we grow, to our I suppose a different perspective on our landscape as well. So I suppose I was delighted to be invited here to talk about Shane's work, and I know I briefly got to mention looking at the images here today, that they're filled with emotion for me when I look at them, and maybe we'll talk about that again in a little while. But I do see peatlands being very connected to people. I think Irish people have a great connection to our peatlands, and just Eamonn's words a few moments ago I think really highlighted that. And Shane's choice of peatlands for for his exhibition, again is a second example of how we're connected to them, and even just this image behind me and the connection that we have. You know, with conservation, the thought might be to disconnect people from our peatlands, and that's not what conservation is about. We still want that connection with our peatlands. We want people to enjoy our peatlands as an amenity value. We want people to enjoy the biodiversity of the bog. We want people to be inspired by our peatland habitat. Just as we remember in our past the wild and wet boglands, and we enjoy them today, and we want future generations to jump on a bog and feel the ground shake. And as part of my education and environmental education with Irish Peatland Conservation Council, I've been so fortunate to bring so many students, and whether you're an 8-year-old child or, you know, a 50 or 60-year-old adult, just taking these, you know, groups to the boglands and, you know, letting them feel the spongy nature of the bog, and, you know, even as an adult, jumping on it and feeling the ground shake. It's just it's an experience, I suppose, that's different. It's unique on Irish peatlands. And to hear and to watch and to look for the birds and the butterflies, and I think that's what's really special to me about the bogs, that we have that and we leave that for the next generation, while we today also enjoy it. It's not just all about the next generation, we also have to enjoy our boglands. We have to appreciate our past. None of us can go back into the past, so we have to appreciate that and acknowledge that peatlands were and still are very valuable to Irish people. But valuable today includes the variety of services, these ecosystem services, the benefits. We valued them for their provisioning factor, what they could give us. Today, we should value them not only for what they can give us, this provisioning factor, but also the cultural significance, their supporting and their regulating roles in climate and water and inspiration and amenity, in biodiversity and disease control, and in food. You know, the cranberries, I believe you were talking about, Eamonn, these red berries out in the bog. So peatlands are, I believe, part of Irish people. I think the peatlands of Ireland should always be connected to Irish people. May that connection be in a different way from our traditional, but I still see peatlands connected to peatland, and for the biodiversity and the climate regulation and all those roles, these ecosystem services, conservation of a sample of these high bogs and wild blanket bogs, I feel is extremely important. So thank you for inviting me along this evening.
Okay. Thanks, Nuala. Wow, so we've had 3 wonderful perspectives there. And Nuala, I feel so relieved. You've twice told us, and we have it on record now, that you told us that we don't have to feel guilty. So I feel absolution, which is great, because I do think there's that feeling of, well, climate action, I think it just feels a little bit overwhelming sometimes, and maybe too much focus on looking back on what we've done rather than being proactive and looking at what we can do, and maybe feeling a little bit crippled by it. But certainly just even your explanation about sort of owning it and embracing it, I think is just really reassuring, I suppose. Nuala, if you wouldn't mind, just before we started, you had a comment about these bogs, just about the fact that there's no people in them. So would you mind just referring back to that again?
Yes, so I unfortunately wasn't able to attend the opening of Shane's exhibition, so I arrived earlier than anyone else, and you know, I came into the room and I was on my own, and maybe it was on my own, but I got this sense of loneliness from the images. I got this sense of, I suppose, peaceful calm as well. But it was really an emotional experience to see the images, to see the boglands. And I'm looking in this direction because these were the 3 images that I was looking at. And I got this sense of loss. And I think that's kind of, from personal experience in comments that my parents have made from their experience of turf cutting in the west of Ireland, and my grandmothers, and visiting these landscapes that were a hive of activity of people. My mum said that, she looked back at the bog when we were walking the dog one day in Mayo, and she said, it's sad. People were part of these boglands, and it was where you met your neighbours on a summer sunless day. It's where you had your cup of tea in the bog, and I see these as very emotional for me to view. But I'd love to ask Shane, do you see our boglands? I see a real potential for connecting people with peatlands again. But do you see that coming, in the future from your artwork as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think like Lochbura there, what they did with Cutaway Bogs, and they got in a couple of artists and sculptors. I think it was nearly 20 years ago now, and they made a lot of sculptures in the park, and they kind of bought that idea of the heritage and the current, and they put and like kind of came up with kind of an artistic response. It kind of was the essence of everything we're talking about here, the past. They have a lovely cycleway around there, and it's a real amenity. And I think I do see that as a connection, but it's obviously going to be a different relationship. Like there is a lot of work ongoing now, I think, with rewilding, and like I know they're in around Dreed and Timahoe. I think there's solar panel farm, and there's some wind turbines, but I think they're actually off the bog, but the solar farm, they'll have walkways around and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, possibly. I think it has to be balanced though. Like I think kind of idea that you have to use the bog for some kind of commercial gain. I think that has to be looked at. I'd love to see. Like for me, I find in winter a lot of these images that I look around now are taken in the winter. And I think I actually enjoy the bog more in the winter for a number of reasons. Because when I used to foot turf, you have dust in your eyes, you have dust everywhere, and you have midgets. And although you have people there and you can talk to them, it was absolutely torturous. And of course you get sunburnt and everything. But in the winter they're beautiful, the colours are still there, there's nobody there, it's wetter, it's kind of like you can see, it's like being in snow, you can see all the footprints, and there's a lovely sense there. Like there'll be sometimes some of these images like somebody that might have been like this one over here with the tree. I waited for a long time for the light to be perfectly right. It was one of those days where it was sunny and cloudy, and I wanted the right amount of light, so I could be there for 45 minutes waiting for it, and there's a real sense of connection. The landscape could be there, the camera set up, I have it framed, ready to go, it's like that, just need the light to be right. So I'm looking around, I'm looking at the ground, and I'm looking at everything and seeing a real sense of connection. You start looking at the plants, you start seeing insects, you start seeing stuff. It's really interesting, and just even spending so much time there, even when you've done that, you still find something interesting there. It's incredible. Like it's an incredible resource. Like, and I found when I made the work, a lot of people assumed that I was taking photographs of wildlife. Nearly everyone, I'd say 9 out of 10 people assumed, and then when I told them it was like the bog culture and foot and turf and the landscapes, they were like, why? I was like, why would you do that? And that's kind of the essence of it. If you don't see what's in front of you, it's really interesting for people from a city or something, or from a foreign country, or even within Ireland. I think that aspect really interested me when I was doing it, because I know this. Like I go beside Lochbura Bog that Eamonn mentioned, where the vine rises, and actually 19 of those photographs, 20 were taken in Lochbura Bog. Quite this one was as well, and a few others too. So that's where the project started. So that's kind of interesting. Kind of meandered there away, but that's kind of what I do with, I can do that with my artistic response to your question. But yeah, I definitely think there is a future, but it is different. But it's kind of for us to find how it fits. I think that's really important.
I think, Shane, what you've done as well, I mean, a lot of the people that were here at the opening night, I imagine some of them are people from these photographs, they wouldn't name themselves, they're all very modest that night. But I thought for those people and anybody else to see work like this, to just reimagine what's in front of them, and, you know, to just see things differently. But I suppose that's what an artistic process is. It's not your responsibility, but that's what happens, that people get to reimagine things. I might just do a little name check as well on for Monica de Bath and Larry Fulham, who are artists from, Larry's a historian and Monica's a visual artist from Madigan, and they actually have an event on tonight, also looking at it's West Kildare, but most of their work is rooted in the bog, and they have a project called Creative Rathangan or Mehel. So it's just funny that the two events clashed, or a little bit of a shame. But and Monica has been working there for over 20 years and working with the men and knowing that, you know, that the future board Namona and the harvesting of the bog was going to come to an end. So obviously a source of inspiration for many artists, and obviously Martin, who spoke here at the launch night as well, very passionately, who didn't grow up, I think he's actually from Dublin, is he? So it's not just people, not just bog men like you, Shane. So anyhow, folks, we might just open up to the floor if anyone has any questions or comments.
I grew up at the other end of the vine in Drogheda, so I had no experience with the bog growing up as a child. And it's funny, you talk about the duality, Shane, of the bog. So my kind of picture of the bog was very negative. You know, it was it was associated with poverty, and the term bogman would be considered like a negative term. And I didn't, you know, we used somebody, you called it bogman, that was a term, you know, of somebody who was some culture around coot or whatever. So they're very negative associations. Now, so I didn't grow up in the bog, so I had no experience. But then I've moved to Kildare for the last 15, 20 years, and so now I'm in the county with the bogs, and hearing stories of the great sense of camaraderie and this family celebration of going to the bog for the day, and you know, literally that kept the off in and becomes a real celebration, you know, and this kind of mental quality to it, which is the duality you're talking about. And I just wondered more about the negative aspects, and you kind of touched on this, that, you know, because it has a sense of poverty and desolation and darkness, you know, in my mind growing up. But yeah, that's changed now, you know, visiting it and going to the IPCC and to see how unique these places are, you know. But I just wonder, from your experience, did you experience it as that negative, dark, you know, kind of place growing up?
I definitely think there's a feeling, I would have felt it, and I'm sure a lot of people felt maybe that of being below or something, or not quite as significant, like the Midlands, they're flat. What do we have to offer here? Like, you know, we don't have the mountains and lakes and, you know, the spectacle kind of tourism. It's not, you know, it's more understated. I think, like, yeah, and I think, like, to go back to where that negative connotation may come from, and Eamonn touched on it there, with people living in the bog. And I think, like, pre-famine era, like when the population just burst, like there was land hunger because there wasn't enough land, so people started looking at land that wouldn't have been previously used, going up into mountains or going into the bogs and the fringes. So I think that element of poverty, of course, then we all know what happened with the famine, and the population ended up getting reduced, so the land hunger kind of shrank. So I think a lot of that comes from there, and that poverty of living in basically a house made of peat or living on the fringes of the bog. So I think it's really interesting, and I think, like, meeting people in the photograph, like, I don't think they really see how fascinating the lifestyle and the culture is, like, and to kind of, like, and I didn't either. I learned a lot throughout the work. Like, I started out with one kind of idea and perspective, and it completely changed. And from talking to people, and there seems to be this thing, nobody ever seems to appreciate something until it's kind of gone. And people, everyone I met who was taking home turf, everyone said, "Oh, sure, we won't be able to do this for much longer." But they accept it, you know, and they understand it, but they also are starting to enjoy it because they only have it for a little bit more, and it's nearly coming to an end, so they know it's coming to an end. Maybe it's like on a night out, and you know that just in 10 minutes, it's coming to an end, so I better enjoy it. So I think there's an aspect of that, that's the human quality that's in us all. But it's a really interesting thing that you picked up on that. I don't mind being called a bogger now, like I call myself a bogger, or bogman, and I know that there's kind of this thing now to not call people coaches or boggers and stuff like that. Like, it's okay for me to say these words because I am these things. But you know, like, they can go the other way as well. Like, you know, if you think that you're less than, you know, he's going to feel like a harsh word, but if you don't, it's just a label that you can call city folk jackeens, or, you know, like, you know.
I think people in Alan Wood particularly made an art form out of the way they clamped turf and the way they looked after their turf. And my dad always said in Kerry they were careless about the way they'd make a clamped turf. Yeah. You know, and I suppose people could live in the bog, families could live in the bog on potatoes on cutaway bog, and they had heat and they had food. You know, it was poorer to live on the fringes of the bog. You needed, in Kildare and parts of Kerry, the bog and the turf was almost like the buffalo to the Indian in Kansas, I think. Whereas the cow dung, the buffalo dung was used for fire, for burning and for heat and meat and shelter. Like I mentioned there, my great grandfather's house would have had straws from the bog on the roof, under the thatch, and bog oak beams on the ceiling of the house. It would have a flat stone floor with an open fire, and it would have been a well-known house for Cadies and Irish music and everything. So the bog was just part of the heritage, deep down. And the bogman thing, I wouldn't mind that at all. I grew up close to Johnstown Bridge, and the fellows in Enfield where I lived used to call the Johnstown lads bogmen. When you put a turf in the bog, I loved doing it as a meeting man because it made your wrists really strong. And I remember I spent my student days in St. Finian's Mullingar, and for catching a ball, there was nothing better than a summer footing turf in the ball. And it left your muscles on your legs so strong that you could kick 50 over the bar. So there were advantages other than monetary advantages. I often think too what Shane said about the bog in winter, even to go there now is beautiful, and to walk down that railway line, which is overgrown now up in Trench 31. It ended in Muckland where I was and where I used to work. But to walk down there now, you almost feel the bog is reclaiming itself, and it's going back to what it really was, like with the wild trees and all growing again where turf was once cut. And a generation of men worked there that didn't get educational opportunities that my generation got. And they were very intelligent people to work with, and I wouldn't call them bogmen entirely. They might have worked in the bog, but they were very, very intelligent men. Some of them worked in England for McAlpine, and a lot of them had great stories. I met one man who, you see the camp in the corner there? I met one man who started off life in the camps, and he said they'd give you a big lump of bread for lunch. And he said you'd need the jaws of an ass to eat. But he said he went on his honeymoon to Newbridge from North Kildare when he got married. So, you know, it kind of puts things into perspective.
I'm just thinking of just about that, going back to what Mark was saying, and just about that hierarchy and notions. But there's an American psychologist, Howard Gardner, and he has a multiple intelligence theory. I don't know if anyone knows him, but it's really interesting. But he has, I think, 8 different types of intelligence that he names, and one of them is knowing the land. You know, in some cultures it's really valued, and others it's not. And I think something last year, if you were to look, you know, those 2 girls that went out in a kayak off the west of Ireland, and the Coast Guards couldn't find them.
That's a good
but the
point.
local fishermen, they knew the way the currents went or whatever. And so they found them, and he said that those guys have an intelligence that mightn't, you know, mightn't have a degree in it, but they knew the sea in the same way as, you know, the bog.
A good bogman will tell you what the bog is like without going there.
Yeah.
Whether to go and collect your turf or not. If it's been raining, you'd say leave it till next week, or whatever. You know, you're right. The same as the currents. It's the same thing. That's a good point.
Anyhow, I'm just conscious of time, folks. Does anybody have any other questions or comments about the exhibition or for any of the panel?
Well, I'd just like to say my interest comes from a horsey background, and there was a man called John Mulvihill.
Oh yeah, he's a distant cousin of mine, second cousin in Kildare.
Jeremiah was from Listowel, and that was his father. He's in Kildare now, in Kildare.
The Bog village, I know very well. I've been
And
there.
he realised that along with the bog, a lot of other things were disappearing, including a local pony. And there's been all sorts of things like the peatland conservation, they've tried to conserve the pony and everything else. But what struck me was how many peripheral things were disappearing along with the pony. There were carts, there were wheelwrights, there were harness makers, there were farriers. There was a whole sort of cottage industry associated with things that were peripheral to the bog, if you know what I mean. But part of the basket makers, to carry the turf and thing, all of those skills have gone, you know, and Jay Shaw-Smith did amazing things photographing the skills just for the last corner of the people who were left doing them, you know. And what you're doing here, it's the same thing, it's the hare's corner, it's the last bit that's left, you know, that you're documenting. It's really very important, it's great.
It's interesting when I say about the bog pony, because the bog pony was the bog pony because he could sidestep those dangerous pools that I was talking about earlier. And you see, the bog pony carried a kind of thing like the Indians used to carry in the Midwest in America. They pull the turf out, you know, I forget the name of them.
Bogies, is it?
Bogies kind of thing.
Slide
They hadn't wheels much at all.
Slide car.
Yeah, slide cars. Well, I think they looked at around Kildare at the DNA of the bog pony, and they discovered, they thought he was a pure Kerry bog pony, but it turned out he was of Viking origin. Did you
Well,
come across that?
yeah, I know all about that. More for Ireland on this something.
Ah,
Yes, they have found northern things, and they're not quite sure how they got to Kerry, but they may well have come in with the Vikings, but that's Shinshkeda.
yeah.
Okay, so folks, any other questions? Comments? I might ask a very unfair question of Shane. So obviously I know you've been very immersed in this exhibition. I think you've actually moved in, there might be a sleeping bag out the back. So I know the installation took some time, and then Shane did artist tours, and then tonight. So I think, I'd say I'd speak on behalf of Riverbank, it's just been such a fantastic exhibition, and you've really added to that Emerging Artist Bursary Award, and I think actually given us ideas for future residencies. I said you'll be a hard act to follow, Shane. But I'm just wondering, can you take the bog man out of the bog in terms of future work, or have you more to do, or what next?
I'm going to step back a little bit, but I'm not finished photographing the bog. It took me, it was 4 years working on it, but it took me 2.5 years to figure out what was done with it, or what was working. So most of the work that's on the wall came in 18 months. So I do plan to do a photo book at some point. I do. There's like a couple of thousand photographs, and I had to pick a couple of teams like Bogs and Metaphor, Duality and Time. Like there's other ones there. So I do plan to do a photo book in due course and publish it, but there's money involved in that. But in terms of, I think the fact that the bog is changing, and that relationship there is still changing. I think I'm still drawn to it, to keep going back, but less often. Maybe like I do plan to make another body of work and start researching that. But this could go on. This could be a life's work, really. I think you know, I'll keep doing it until it stops being interesting, or I stop finding interest in it, if you know what I mean. It was quite intense for quite a while, so I will enjoy stepping back and just photographing in my own time, and it'll be interesting to see when, like I think maybe when it's kind of ended, that the working relationship is really coming to an end, when there starts to be a nostalgia and you know, for what was rather than what's almost gone, you know. Then you know that when it's gone, then the interest is different, you know. It's history then, rather than it's history in motion, or maybe I'm not explaining it quite well, but anyway, that's where I'm going. So I'm not quite finished with it, but I'm happy to take the milestone and take a break and just not go at it as hard as I was.
Okay, well, congratulations, Shane. It's a beautiful show.
Thanks very much.
I think it's obviously made with a lot of passion and care and craft. I mean, they're stunning. So well done. And I just shout out to my colleagues in Kildare, in the Riverbank Arts Centre, who really, and I know Caroline particularly, has been really pushing the promotion and marketing of this. And I know just in terms of the bursary that's awarded, there is a financial award for the bursary, but I think everybody who got it so far has said that all the other support, so hanging the show, the marketing, all of those other softer support, but they're real, and it's people's time and resources and expertise, and that is always added to the value of the residency beyond just just giving you money to make the work. So hopefully that was a good experience for you.
100%. Like there's a lot in doing a solo exhibition. I've done some group ones, but when you do a solo one, it was a learning process. So if I had to do another one, I've learned so much, and having to get stuff ready in time, and lead-ins for stuff and marketing and installing and stuff. So it was really helpful to have that support from marketing support. Caroline and Matt did a lot of work, and then hanging it as well, having someone to actually help. It was I'm not going to use any words I shouldn't use, but it was a difficult one to hang. Me and Declan, it's been 3 days here and a few easy fits. It ended up good on the end, so I'm happy with that.
Very good, very
But
good.
thanks very much for the support. Really appreciate that award and giving me a great opportunity to have this work on the wall. It's a huge milestone for me. It's very important for me.
Brilliant. Well, it's just testament of what the award can do for. I think it's a win-win situation, Shane. But we're going to actually give the last word to Eamonn, if that's okay. So Eamonn is going to read a poem for us.
I just have a little poem. I like to remember men who worked in the bog, and this is called Bog Hardship, 1960s, and I'll just read it before you conclude. There were wet days in the bog too. There were no fine days with sunburn, as Shane said. Entering the dark brown bog, under a rain-filled morning sky, ferns dripping, wetting our knees, along the well-trodden pathway where the purple heather gleamed. Then the long walk down the rail line, up the trench top to the peat plot, where the turf looked sodden, too recently cut by the bagger to have a skin thick enough for handling. Next to us, Joe Bro, short and stocky, back bent, squelched his boots against the watery bog base, footing turf alone with his thoughts. God bless the work, Joe. Conversation raised his head. Comradeship gave him comfort. Isolation faded away. Joe smiled at shared hardship. Further up on higher ground, Paddy Norris stood smoking a fag, sideways in his mouth as always. He waved a greeting our way, then paused, looking around, surveying the great expanse of merciless bog. At the 10 o'clock tea, the billy cans boiled over blazing sods from the clamp. Men talked of hardship worse than this in years gone by, working for a pittance for farmers in West Limerick, or slaving with McAlpine on England's roads, saving the harvest in 47 in Ballina when the army was called out to help, the worst and wettest year of all, snagging turnips in frosty November drills. Oh, that was the hardship. Perhaps the bog is not so bad after all.
Thank you, Eamonn. So
They're just my thoughts on a bad day in the bog.
very good.
Wet for.
Okay, so just finally, just to thank Eamonn sincerely for all the preparation and thought you put into your presentation, and for Nuala for speaking so passionately today. So hopefully you'll inspire more proactive work and action on the bog, and so the Peatland Conservation Council, are you open at the moment? Are people?
Yeah, we are. We're open Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m.
Great.
Of course, as Shane said, it's pretty cold down the bog, so wrap up warm if you're intending to visit. But yes, boglands are seasonal at this time of year. The bogs are retreating, they're hibernating against the the winter and the freezing conditions, but from spring they emerge, the yellows of the bog asphodel, the purples of the heathers, the cry of the curlew, and of course those insect-eating sundews. So they're well worth a visit, our Irish boglands.
Okay, thanks, Nuala. Okay, all right. So everybody, thanks for coming. Really appreciate your time tonight. See you.